So the HOA was tearing down my lake house because I supposedly didn't pay HOA fees. Fees for an association I wasn't even part of. I came back from a 6-week trip to find a wrecking ball smashing through the walls of the home I built with my own hands. They destroyed everything, including my late wife's piano. The foreman just handed me some fake paperwork and said, "You're part of the HOA now." But as the HOA president stood there smirking, thinking she'd won, she had no idea that I secretly owned the one thing that gave me total control over her and every single home in their neighborhood. How far would you go to get back everything they stole? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because you're about to see what real ownership looks like. The old RV groaned as I turned off the main road. 6 weeks is a long time to be away. The trip to see my daughter and her kids was worth every mile. But I was ready for home. My home. The gravel on my private drive crunched under the tires, a familiar sound that always meant peace. It was just after 6 o'clock in the morning, 6:12 to be exact. The sun was still low, throwing long shadows across the lake. That's when I smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. This was different. It was the bitter smell of dust and diesel fuel, the kind of scent that hangs over a disaster scene. I'd smelled it 1,000 times in my career as a fire chief. It never means anything good. I steered the RV around the last bend of pines, my foot already easing off the gas. And then I saw it. The scene didn't make sense. My mind couldn't put the pieces together. There were men in yellow hard hats moving around my property. A big yellow excavator sat where my front lawn should be, its huge metal arm resting in a pile of rubble. My rubble. My home. My heart hammered against my ribs. A cold, sick feeling spreading through. Jeez, my gut! I slammed the RV into park, not even bothering to turn off the engine. I stumbled out, my boots hitting the ground with a thud. It was all gone. The lakefront home I had designed and built with my own 2 hands 22 years ago was a pile of splintered wood and broken glass. Well, not all of it. One wall of the living room was still standing like a crooked tombstone. Through the gaping hole where the kitchen used to be, I could see the lake, calm and indifferent. The excavator had just punched clean through it. I saw the big cast-iron sink I'd installed, now twisted into a useless shape. And then my eyes locked on something that made the air leave my lungs. Half buried under a pile of drywall and roofing shingles was my late wife's piano. It was smashed to pieces. The beautiful dark wood splintered, the white keys scattered like broken teeth. I had bought that for her for our 25th anniversary. She used to play it every single evening, the music drifting out over the water. Now it was just trash. I started walking toward the mess, my mind a blank fog of shock and rage. A man in a clean hard hat and an orange vest walked over to meet me, holding a clipboard like a shield. He had the tired, impatient look of a man on a schedule. He was the foreman. I could tell by the way the other men glanced at him. "Sir, you can't be here. This is a demolition site," he said, his voice flat. I just stared at him, then back at the wreckage of my life. "This is my home," I said. My own voice sounded strange, distant. "What is going on here?" The foreman sighed like I was an inconvenience he'd been expecting. He flipped a page on his clipboard. "We posted the demo notice 3 times, buddy. First one went up 6 months ago. You didn't pay your HOA dues." The words hit me like a physical blow. HOA dues. I could feel a cold, sharp anger cutting through the shock. It was the kind of feeling that makes you very calm, very focused. "I'm not in any HOA," I said, keeping my voice steady. I looked him dead in the eye. "I own 12 acres here. My property line ends a 1/4 mile from the new neighborhood they built across the way. My land was never part of their tract. I made sure of it." The foreman just gave me a small, dismissive smirk. He tapped his clipboard with a pen. You are now. You are now. The words hung in the air, heavier than the dust from my ruined home. My mind reeled back, trying to find the flaw in his statement. It was like a faulty wire in an electrical panel. You know it's there, you just have to trace it back to the source. My source was 12 years ago. A big developer had bought up the 200 acres of farmland that bordered my property. He wanted to build a subdivision, one of those master-planned communities with winding streets named after trees that weren't there. He offered me a fortune for my 12 acres, wanting the lake frontage for his premium lots. I said no. This land was where my wife and I had built our life. It wasn't for sale. So we made a deal, the developer and I. We hired surveyors, walked the property lines, and drove iron stakes deep into the earth. My 12 acres were legally and officially carved out of the new tract. We filed the paperwork with the county. I had a separate parcel number, a separate deed. The documents were ironclad. I watched them build that neighborhood home by home. They called it Heron Creek Estates. They formed a homeowners association. I read their covenants just out of curiosity. They were a thick stack of rules about lawn height, mailbox color, and what kind of flag you could fly. It had nothing to do with me. I was on the other side of the property line. The foreman's smirk told me he didn't care about deeds or surveys. He cared about the paper on his clipboard. He finally ordered his crew to stop for the day, seeing I wasn't going to leave. After they rumbled away, leaving me in the silence of my own disaster, I walked over to my mailbox at the end of the long drive. It was stuffed full, junk mail, bills, and 2 official-looking envelopes. Both were from the Heron Creek Estates HOA. The first was a certified letter with a green return receipt card tucked inside. I hadn't been home to sign for it, of course. I tore it open. Inside was a notice dated 2 months prior. It claimed I was in arrears for 6 months of HOA dues plus late fees, totaling nearly $3,000. It was formal, filled with legal-sounding phrases about liens and compliance. The second envelope contained a photocopy of what looked like minutes from an HOA board meeting. A single paragraph was circled in red ink. It described a vote taken 4 months ago to retroactively annex my property into the HOA. The reason given was to ensure aesthetic cohesion for the community's lakefront view. They had voted to absorb my land, my home, and they had never even told me. I had been on the road visiting my grandkids while a handful of strangers on a power trip were voting my life away. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice in my veins. This was wrong. This wasn't just a mistake in paperwork. It was a deliberate land grab. I pulled out my phone and dialed the county records office. A pleasant-sounding woman answered. I gave her my name and parcel number and explained that my home was being demolished. I asked if the county had condemned it for any reason. "One moment, Mr. Whitaker," she said. I heard the quiet clicking of a keyboard. The silence stretched on. I looked at the splintered wood that used to be my porch, the porch where my wife and I drank coffee every morning. "No," the clerk said, her voice sounding confused. "I have no record of a condemnation order for your property. Your home had a clear certificate of occupancy. Your property taxes are paid in full." I took a slow breath. The foreman for the demolition crew said he had a permit pulled by the Heron Creek HOA. More clicking, then a long pause. When she spoke again, her professional tone was gone. She sounded troubled. "Mr. Whitaker, this is very strange. I see the demolition permit you're talking about. It was pulled by the HOA, just like you said. But—" She hesitated. "According to our official maps, your parcel isn't even in their jurisdiction. They have no legal authority over your property." The ice in my veins turned to steel. My training as a fire chief kicked in. You don't get emotional at the scene of a fire. You get facts. You find the point of origin. "Then who signed the order?" I asked, my voice flat. "Who authorized the permit?" There was another pause. "Sir, I probably shouldn't—" she started, but I cut her off. My name is Jack Whitaker. I was the fire chief for this county for 30 years. I know a thing or two about official documents. A crime has been committed here, and I need to see that signature." She must have heard the authority in my voice, the absolute lack of doubt. "All right, Jack," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm sending the PDF to your email right now." My phone buzzed a second later. I opened the file. It was the standard county demolition permit, and there at the bottom in the box labeled Property Owner Authorization was my signature, or at least it was supposed to be. I stared at it. It was my name in my handwriting, but it was too perfect, too clean. There were no variations in the digital ink, no pressure points. It looked sterile. And then I remembered. 8 years ago, a hailstorm had damaged my roof. I had to pull a permit for the repairs. I had signed the form at the county office on a digital pad. The signature was identical. They hadn't just forged my name. They had found an old permit in the county's digital records, copied my signature, and pasted it onto a demolition order for my own home. This wasn't an overreach. This was fraud. This was a felony, and they were going to pay for it. My RV became my command center. I sat at the small dinette table, my laptop open, the generator humming softly outside. Through the window, I could see the wreckage of my house, a constant, ugly reminder of what was at stake. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. An engine needs fuel. My fuel was injustice. I wasn't just a victim. I was a fire chief who had spent his life investigating scenes, finding the point of origin, and figuring out who was responsible. This was no different. It was an investigation. The hunt for receipts had begun. I started with what I could control, my own records. I pulled up my email account, searching for anything from Heron Creek Estates HOA. Nothing. I checked my spam folder, my trash folder. Nothing. They had claimed to send notices, but there was no digital trail. Fine. They said they posted notices on my property. I had security cameras installed 5 years ago after a few kids were caught fishing off my dock without permission. The system recorded to a hard drive and uploaded clips to the cloud whenever it detected motion. I logged into my account. I spent the next 3 hours going back 6 weeks, then 2 months, then 6 months. I watched every single clip. I saw the mailman coming and going. I saw deer nibbling at the bushes. I saw a family of raccoons trying to get into my trash cans. What I never saw, not once, was a single person walking up to my front door to post a notice. The camera would have caught them. They lied. It was a simple, provable lie. That was step 1. Step 2 was to find out who they were. A quick search online led me to the Heron Creek Estates HOA website. It was mostly generic, filled with pictures of happy families and reminders about lawn maintenance. But I found a public documents section, a sort of online filing cabinet. It was poorly organized. Most of the links were broken, but I am a patient man. I started clicking on everything, digging deeper. Tucked away in a forgotten corner was a link to an old community forum, the kind people used before social media took over. It was a digital ghost town, but the posts were still there. I started reading and then I found it. A thread from 4 months ago started by the board president, a woman named Linda Rosiel. The subject line was uncooperative lakefront property. She was talking about me. I read her posts, my blood turning to ice. She wrote about the eyesore of my older custom-built home not matching their cookie-cutter aesthetic. She complained about my refusal to sell years ago, and then I saw the message that laid it all bare. It was the 3rd email in the chain, sent by her. It read, "If he won't sell, we'll force a compliance lien. We'll make it make sense. Trust me, we'll make it make sense." The words of a bully who knows the rules are against her, so she plans to break them and fix the story later. Now I had motive. I went back to the forged demolition permit on my laptop. I put it side by side with the old roofing permit from 2014 I had saved in my own files. On the roofing permit, my signature captured on a digital pad had a distinct blue tint. The forgery on the demolition permit was stark black. It was a photocopy of a photocopy, a ghost. But that wasn't the real proof. Most people don't know that a PDF file carries its own history, its own fingerprints. It's called metadata. I opened the properties of the demolition permit PDF, and there it was. A log of every time the file was created, opened, and modified. The original permit was created at the county office during business hours. But there was another entry. A modificat. Ion. The file had been edited, saved, and finalized on a home computer registered to a user named Linda R. The timestamp made my breath catch in my throat. The final change was made at 2:27 a.m. on a Tuesday night. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a planned, deliberate act of fraud, cooked up in the dead of night. The next morning, I drove into town and went to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk was Sheriff Miller, a man I'd known for 30 years. We had worked dozens of fire and emergency scenes together. "Jack," he said, his face clouding with concern as he stood up to shake my hand. "I heard about your place. I'm so sorry." We sat in his office. I didn't raise my voice. I just laid it out piece by piece. The lack of notices, the security footage, the HOA forum post. I showed him the 2 permits on my tablet, the 2 signatures side by side. I pointed to the metadata, the timestamp, 2:27 a.m. He leaned back in his chair, a grim look on his face. "Jack, officially you need to file a formal complaint and we'll open an investigation. You know the process." I nodded. But he said, leaning forward and lowering his voice, "You didn't hear this from me. That HOA, Linda Rosiel, this isn't their first go at a land grab." He explained that his office had received at least a half-dozen similar complaints over the past few years. Bogus fines, threats of liens, people being pressured over property lines. But every single one of them had backed down. They had settled quietly, paid a fine, or given up a few feet of their yard just to make the headache go away. He opened a drawer and slid a simple sheet of paper across the desk. It was a list of names and phone numbers. "These are the people who called us," he said. "They were too scared to go on the record. Maybe they'll talk to you." I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I stood up and shook his hand. I wasn't angry anymore. I was determined. Others had been bullied into silence. Not this time. This time, they had picked the wrong man. To fight a lie, you need the truth. A truth so hard and so heavy that it can crush their story. I had the digital proof, the emails, the forged signature, the 2:27 a.m. timestamp, but that was all on a screen. I needed something real, something you could hold in your hand. I needed physical proof that my house was sound, that there was no reason other than greed to tear it down. And for that, I knew exactly who to call. Doug Mallister. We called him Stitch back in the day because he could patch up any broken thing, whether it was a cracked fire engine chassis or a rookie's rattled nerves. He was a retired structural engineer, a Vietnam vet who still walked with a slight limp and a whole lot of authority. He knew building codes better than most lawyers know the law. I called him. I didn't even have to finish explaining. "I'll be there in an hour, Jack," he grumbled. "Got my boots on." Stitch arrived in his old Ford pickup, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a beat-up hard hat in the other. He walked over to the edge of the rubble, leaning on his cane, and just stood there for a full minute, silent. His jaw was tight. "This wasn't a collapse, Jack," he said, his voice a low growl. "This was an execution." He didn't need to see any paperwork to know that. He could read the story in the way the walls had fallen. He spent the next hour walking the perimeter, his expert eyes scanning everything. He looked at the rebar sticking out of the concrete foundation. He picked up pieces of shattered load-bearing beams. Then he looked at me. "They'll claim it was unsafe, condemned, a hazard to the community. We have to prove they're lying." I nodded. "How do we do that?" Stitch just smiled, a grim, humorless expression. "We build a case, brick by brick." His first tool wasn't a hammer. It was a drone. He pulled a compact little quadcopter from a case in his truck. "The best inspector is the one who sees everything," he said as he sent it buzzing into the air. From the tablet in his hands, we got a bird's-eye view of the entire scene. He flew it low and slow over the foundation, the camera pointing straight down. The images that came back were crystal clear. We were looking for stress fractures, big, ugly cracks that would prove the concrete slab was failing. There were none. The foundation I had poured 22 years ago was as solid as the day I built it. There was no upheaval, no sinking, no sign of any structural failure whatsoever. "Print these out in high resolution," Stitch said, saving the files. "Exhibit A. The foundation was sound." Next, he had me pull out my original blueprints and construction permits. He spread them out on the hood of his truck, tracing the lines with his finger. "Half-inch rebar, 12 inches on center, double-joisted floor supports, hurricane ties on every rafter. Jack, you didn't build a house, you built a fortress. I'd have signed off on this structure for 100 years. That's when he zeroed in on the next step. If the house wasn't failing, he said, tapping the blueprints, they would have needed an inspection report saying it was. A licensed inspector has to sign off on a condemnation before a demo permit can even be issued for safety reasons. Get me a copy of that inspection report. I went back to the county records office. This time, I knew what to ask for. I requested any and all inspection reports filed for my parcel number in the last year. The clerk returned with a single sheet of paper. It was an emergency structural inspection report filed by the HOA 3 months ago. It was filled with vague terms like foundation settling and roof truss instability. At the bottom was a signature above the typed name of a state-licensed inspector I actually knew, a guy named Bill Johnson. I took a photo of it and sent it to Stitch. His reply came 2 minutes later. It was just one sentence. "Look at the spelling." I zoomed in on the form. There it was. The inspector's last name was Johnson, spelled Johnsen. But on the form, clear as day, it was spelled Johnson, Johnson. A man doesn't misspell his own name on an official document. It was another forgery, sloppy, arrogant. They never thought anyone would actually check. Later that evening, after Stitch had gone home with a list of codes they had violated, I was walking through the wreckage myself. I was numb, just putting one foot in front of the other. I stepped over what used to be the living room wall and saw a large, flat piece of dark wood sticking out from under a pile of drywall. It was the lid from my wife's piano. I pulled it free. It was cracked clean in half, the beautiful polished finish spider-webbed with scratches. As I ran my hand over the broken surface, my fingers caught on a small brass hinge. I remembered this. There was a small, shallow compartment inside the lid where she used to keep her sheet music. On a whim, I pried it open. Inside, untouched by the dust and debris, was a small plastic thumb drive. I had no idea what was on it. I took it back to the RV and plugged it into my laptop. There was only one folder labeled "For the Kids." I clicked on it. It was full of video files. I opened the first one. My wife's face filled the screen. It was recorded a few months before she passed. She was sitting at the piano, smiling into the camera. She looked so happy. She started to talk, leaving a message for our grandkids, telling them stories about when their mom was a little girl. And then she looked right into the camera as if she were looking right at me right now. Her voice was as clear as I remembered it. "Things break," she said, her smile turning soft. "But they'll never take away what matters, not from you. What we build inside, what we build together, that's forever." I closed the laptop. She was right. They had taken my house, but they couldn't take what really mattered. And now I wasn't just fighting to get my property back. I was fighting for her. For 2 days, I did nothing but prepare. I lived on coffee and sandwiches in my RV, parked just out of sight of my property's entrance. I made phone calls. I used the list of names Sheriff Miller had given me. I spoke to a man who was fined $2,000 because his fence was allegedly 6 inches over a non-existent property line. I spoke to a woman who was threatened with a lien because the shade of beige she painted her trim wasn't on the APPR oved list. They were all scared. Linda Roselle had bullied them into submission with paperwork and threats. They had stories, but they didn't have proof. I did. I had a mountain of it. Stitch had sent me his final report. A 10-page document, complete with high-resolution drone photos and citations of the exact building codes my home had not only met but exceeded. I printed out everything. I made 20 copies and organized them into neat packets. Each packet contained the official county map showing my property lines, the forged demolition permit next to my real signature on the roofing permit, the fraudulent inspection report with the misspelled name circled in red, and Stitch's full engineering analysis. The final piece of my preparation was a small digital audio recorder, no bigger than my thumb. I checked the battery twice. It was time to stop investigating and start acting. The HOA board meeting was held in the clubhouse of the Heron Creek Estates, a sterile, windowless room with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. It smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. About 15 residents were scattered around the room, looking bored. At the front, behind a long folding table, sat the board. In the center was Linda Roselle. She wore a sharp navy blue pantsuit and a tight, fixed smile. She ran the meeting like a drill sergeant, her voice sharp and condescending as she shot down a resident's request for a new type of flowering bush. "The approved list is the approved list for a reason, Mark," she said, her tone dripping with false patience. "It ensures aesthetic cohesion." I sat in the back, silent. I let her go through her agenda items. I watched her wield her little gavel, radiating an aura of absolute control over her tiny kingdom. She didn't notice me at first. When she finally did, her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, but her smile never faltered. She saw me as a problem that had already been solved, a piece of trash that had been swept off the board. She was about to find out how wrong she was. When she reached the new business portion of the meeting, I stood up. A few heads turned. The room got quiet. Linda looked at me, her smile tightening. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice like fingernails on a chalkboard. "This meeting is for members of the Heron Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I believe your membership status is resolved." I gave her a calm, steady look. "I'm not here as a member, Linda. I'm here as the owner of the property you illegally demolished." I walked to the front of the room and placed a stack of my prepared packets on the table in front of her. Then I turned and began handing them out to the other board members and the residents in the audience. People took them, their faces a mixture of confusion and curiosity. I watched Linda's eyes scan the first page, the official county map. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she replaced it with a mask of indignation. "This is highly irregular," she sputtered. "These documents are unverified." "They're all public record," I said, my voice filling the quiet room. "As you can see on page 1, my proprie, Artai, has never been part of this HOA. On page 2, you'll find the demolition permit bearing my forged signature, which was copied from a 2014 roofing permit, also included for comparison. On page 3, you have the fraudulent inspection report. You'll note that the inspector's name is misspelled. A man rarely makes that mistake on an official document." A low murmur spread through the room. People were flipping through the pages, their eyes wide. I saw one man, an older gentleman on the board, slide his chair back from the table, his face pale. I wasn't finished. I pulled the small digital recorder from my pocket and held it up. "But the most important piece of evidence isn't on paper," I said, looking directly at Linda. "It's a recording from your own community forum of you explaining your plan." I pressed play. Linda's voice, tiny but unmistakable, filled the silent room. It was from the cached forum thread I had found. "He thinks he's outside the HOA," her recorded voice chirped confidently. "We rewrote the boundary map." The gasp from the residents was a single, sharp sound. The room was dead silent. Every eye was on Linda. Her face had gone from pale to beet red. The mask was gone. All that was left was pure, undiluted rage and panic. The older board member who had pushed his chair back quietly stood up and walked out of the room without a word. Before anyone else could react, a man in a cheap suit at the end of the table stood up. He was the HOA's lawyer. He adjusted his tie and puffed out his chest. "This is a gross violation of privacy!" he blustered, trying to sound intimidating. "This recording is inadmissible. None of this will hold up in court, Mr. Whitaker." He looked at me with a dismissive sneer, confident that the threat of legal action would silence me, just as it had silenced everyone else. I just looked at him, and for the first time that evening I let myself smile. It was a small, dry smile. "That's fine," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I'm not going to court. I'm going to title." The lawyer's smug expression faltered. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The phrase, "I'm going to title," hung in the air, a piece of jargon he understood perfectly, but the residents did not. Linda Rosiel just stared at me, a blank, confused look on her face. For the first time, she was out of her depth. She understood rules and bylaws, but she didn't understand the ground beneath her feet. I let the silence stretch out, letting the weight of those words sink in. The residents looked at each other, then at me, waiting for an explanation. I gave it to them. "You see, about 20 years ago," I began, my voice calm and even, "the original developer who built this neighborhood, a company called Thompson Development, went bankrupt. It happened right after they finished paving the roads and laying the utility lines, but before they sold off all the lots. In the bankruptcy sale, the assets were split up. Most people just bid on the empty lots where your houses are now. But I bought something different. I wasn't interested in building a subdivision. I was interested in protecting my own peace and quiet." I paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with the confused homeowners. "I bought the land the roads are built on. I bought the mineral rights beneath every single one of your homes. I bought the easements that give this community access to water, sewer, and power." A nervous cough broke the silence. The lawyer had gone pale. He knew exactly what I was saying. Linda, however, still looked defiant. "That's impossible! The HOA owns the common areas," she declared, her voice a little too loud. "No, Linda, it doesn't," I replied, keeping my voice level. "The HOA was granted an easement. An easement is a legal right to use land you do not own for a specific purpose. Your HOA had an easement to use my land for your roads and another for your utilities. And like any legal agreement, an easement can be terminated if the terms are violated." I picked up one of my packets from her desk and held it up. "Demolishing the property of the man who granted you that access is what lawyers would call a catastrophic breach of that agreement." The blood drained from Linda's face. She finally understood. The lawyer sank into his chair and put his head in his hands. "As of 8 o'clock this morning," I continued, "I had my attorney file a termination of all access and utility easements for the Heron Creek Estates. The road you drove on to get here tonight, Heron Creek Lane, is now officially a private road. My private road. Access is revoked." A woman in the front row gasped. "You can't do that! How will we get to our homes?" I turned my attention to her. "I'm a reasonable man. For the next 48 hours, I will permit residents to come and go. After that, a gate is being installed at the entrance. I suggest you get your groceries." The room exploded in a chorus of angry, panicked voices. "What about the mail? The school bus? This is insane!" I let them shout for a moment before raising my hand for quiet. This brings me to my next point. I pulled 3 more envelopes from my jacket pocket. This morning, I also had cease and desist letters delivered to your contractors. The first is to your landscaping company, as they would now be trespassing on my property to mow your lawns. Their contract is void. The second is to your private security company. That man who drives around in the fake HOA lice car. He's no longer allowed on my road. And the third, I said, looking directly at the lawyer, is to the demolition company that destroyed my home, informing them that the work order they received was based on fraudulent documents and that their equipment is currently parked on my private land. That's when the residents' anger turned from me to Linda. A man stood up, jabbing his finger at her. You knew this? You knew he owned the roads and you never told us. Another woman cried out, Our property values will be zero. We'll be cut off. Linda was stammering, trying to regain control, but her power had evaporated. It was built on a flimsy foundation of rules and fines, and I had just kicked out the supports. While the shouting continued, a man and his wife quietly approached me. I recognized him from the list Sheriff Miller had given me. It was the Millers. Mr. Whitaker, he said, his voice low. Linda denied our permit to build a wheelchair ramp for my wife's mother. She said the treated lumber wasn't on the approved materials list. I looked at his wife, who looked exhausted and defeated. I thought of my own wife and the ramp I had planned to add to our home one day. I nodded. Your ramp has nothing to do with the HOA, I told him, loud enough for others to hear. Your property is subject to county building codes, not Linda's personal taste. Get a permit from the county. Build your ramp. If anyone from the HOA sets foot on your property to stop you, they'll be trespassing. He stared at me for a moment, and then a slow, hopeful smile spread across his face. He reached out and shook my hand. It was a small moment, but it changed the feeling in the room. I wasn't a new tyrant. I was the one who was finally tearing down the fake walls Linda had built around them all. Things fell apart quickly after that meeting. Linda Rosielle's tiny empire, built on a bedrock of lies, crumbled under the weight of one simple truth. She didn't own the ground it stood on. The community she had ruled with an iron fist turned on her. Panic is a powerful motivator. The residents, facing the reality of being stranded in their own homes, held an emergency meeting without her. They voted to remove her and the entire board. But it was too little, too late. The HOA was effectively powerless. They couldn't hire a lawyer to fight me because that would mean paying the lawyer, and they couldn't collect dues to pay him. It was a perfect feedback loop of failure. Linda, however, didn't go quietly. A cornered animal is a dangerous one. 2 days after the meeting, as a crew was installing the posts for my new gate at the end of